Good afternoon, everyone. We are broadcasting live from our offices here in Centurion on this, what is a beautiful, warm autumn day in Pretoria. It's really nice to see quite a few familiar names joining us again this afternoon. I know it's been a few months since we were on this platform. You may know that we've presented to over 30 webinars already, and we're extremely happy to be back. A warm welcome to each and every one of you, and thank you so much for joining us again. While everyone is settling in, I just want to inform you all who is virtually joining us. We've got close to 570 people that registered, and I know there's 18 disciplines. To give you a bit more information, there's close to about 150 psychologists, just over 100 physiotherapists, there's 74 occupational therapists, close to 50 speech therapists and audiologists. There's about 30 biokineticians, 20 dietitians. We've got registered counselors, podiatrists, close to 40 medical orthotists and prosthetists. And then there's also quite a few social workers, chiropractors, optometrists, and even a few doctors. I think most people have settled in, but just a quick reminder that all our previous webinars are available, and you can view them or listen to them via 4 different platforms. I'm just quickly going to copy these links and paste them in the chat functionality so that you can view them or copy them from there. Let me see if I can do that. Press enter. There we go. So please do go and listen to them or download the podcast. So the topic of today's conversation, though, is the future of healthcare systems and how to turn what might be considered a threat into an opportunity. And joining us to discuss this today is Barry Childs. Barry is the joint CEO of Insight Actuaries and Consultants. He started his health career, as far as I know, back at Liberty Health back in the day, and then moved to Discovery Health, where he specialized in managed care analytics and healthcare provider risk management strategies. But Barry, if I'm not wrong, I think you started your consulting practice way back when in 2007, which was then merged into Insight Actuaries and Consultants in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. For those of you who know Barry, you would know that he's extremely passionate about healthcare, and he provides advice to a range of public and private healthcare role players on matters that might include strategy, analytics, and policy. So we're all delighted that you can be with us here this afternoon, Barry, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure, Lani. Thank you for you and Dion for having me, particularly in the light of the very impressive guests you've had speaking before. So thanks for the privilege and opportunity to join you. Do you want me to dive right in?
Let me just quickly tell the guests who's Dion. So Dion is a regular speaker, Barry, and I think everyone knows him as the director of Profnet Medical. He's also an executive with the SpaceNet Global Group. Everyone knows that Dion is a physiotherapist by training with years of clinical experience and also an incredible passion for efficient and especially improved healthcare. So Dion, welcome and nice to see you again.
Thanks, Lani. Good afternoon. How's it, Barry? Thanks so much for joining us. It's really an honor to be with us. Yeah.
All the attendees, this afternoon's webinar is brought to you by EZMed. As you know, it's a very powerful practice management solution, which is mobile, intelligent, and extremely easy to use, and it's powered by Profnet. You'll be glad to hear that the webinar has also been accredited for 1 ethical CEU point, and I would just like to thank Wendy from our DAX Academy of Healthcare team for all her help and support. You might know me. My name is Lani Ace. I'm a product manager with the SpaceNet Global Group, and it's my honor to be your host for this afternoon. All the attendees, please chat with us this afternoon. We will definitely keep an eye on the chat or the Q&A functionality. So post your questions or your comments in there, and hopefully our guest speakers will keep an eye on that as well. But Barry, let's kick off. And perhaps you can start by painting us a picture or just giving us a broad overview of what you think the future of healthcare holds in South Africa and perhaps even globally. So over to you.
Thanks, Lani. I'm going to try and share a few slides with you. So, I mean, the way that I speak about this topic, which I find fascinating, and we spend quite a bit of time at Insight thinking about this, is sort of in a couple of big sort of chapter headings based on the macro trends that we see emerging in the literature and around the world in the systems, the health systems that we operate in. So we're Insight is the largest healthcare-focused actuarial consultancy locally, and probably in many other domains. We're sitting now with 45 about actuarial resources, mainly focused in the healthcare space. So outside of, say, a Discovery, we would have the largest concentration of analytical talent looking at healthcare data, thinking about healthcare systems, etc. And that gives us a very interesting perspective from multiple angles, because we consult to both the funding side, medical schemes and health insurers, and also providers, whether it's hospital groups or pathology groups or the radiological society, or wherever there's an interesting data or reimbursement or health policy conundrum, we get involved. And so we spend a fair bit of time thinking about what the future of that environment might look like so that we can adapt and stay relevant. So I'm going to take you through a couple of the sort of key themes of what we think that the future of healthcare holds. And the first one is that the future of healthcare is political. It's impossible to divorce healthcare from politics, because it's often enshrined in a constitution in some kind of way, like it is in ours. It's so close to human rights, the right to be well, the right to be healthy, the right to get access to care. And along with that comes all of the pros and cons of proximity to politics, which is agency and representation, but also problems. I mean, the headlines I've put up here are last year or year before's news. The sort of the politics around COVID internationally were clear as day for everybody to see, extraordinarily polarizing globally, particularly in America, but even East and West. You would have seen the US is now making noises about doing a proper, thorough investigation around the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 and where it came from, out of Wuhan, etc. Was it lots of conspiracy theories and all sorts of things? But the politics are impossible to divorce from healthcare, and the downsides of that are polarization, the risk of corruption, and we have our own case in point now, again locally, with sort of political corruption making its sort of rearing its head, its spectre in private healthcare, public healthcare again, and private healthcare. On the one hand, you've got the minister embroiled in a investigation, and then you've got on the other hand, you've got a carte blanche featuring a private specialist hospital. So it's these things are unavoidable. And deeply unfortunate, but they are part of the system. The way that plays out in South Africa, in particular, from a commercial point of view, or from a financial point of view, let me rather say, is in a very particular way. So if we look at expenditure levels and the way that they play out in the population, so the spend per annum per head in private healthcare in South Africa, this is just medical scheme data. This is not out of pocket or life insurance or health insurance. Call it 18,000 Rand per year per head. It's a little bit more than that. That's about a year old, that figure. Whereas for the public sector, it's 3,630 odd, and the proportions of the population covered respectively are 84% and 16%. And this sort of disparity, and then there's out-of-pocket expenditure, which both sectors spend. And it's this disparity, it's about a 5 times difference in expenditure. Now that results in a disparity in availability of beds, doctors, other healthcare professionals like yourselves. It's particularly acute amongst psychologists, social workers, speech therapists, what would be deemed sort of more luxurious items in the public care setting, and where there's even a shortage in the private sector for some disciplines. There are vast differences in the availability of those resources between the public and the private sector, and that is going to play out politically, because it's about access. And is it fair that some people, because they're wealthier and can access a private market, are entitled to access better care? It's important here to distinguish, and useful actually in your mind, to distinguish between quality care and luxury care. Perfectly fine if you're wealthy to want a private room and have the latest, greatest of some kind of technology. But at a baseline level, quality medicine, quality healthcare, should that depend on how wealthy you are? And typically the answer for that is no. But unless there's enough money to go around, it's an almost unavoidable problem, because what do? I mean, if you spread that money over the whole population, you're not actually gaining that much. But people do forget, the common rhetoric is, well, the public sector must just do better with the money that it's got. But people forget how little that is. It's roughly the equivalent of your morning cup of coffee every day. If you have a decent flat white or latte in the morning, you have that every day for the month. That's the public health budget per person. So it's not a lot of money that they have to work with. And so I like to show this kind of number because it puts those things in context in the South African setting.
Barry, if I may interrupt you there just with a quick question. How do you, in your previous slide, that's obviously based in South African figures. How does that compare with some of the overseas countries?
Okay, that's a great question. So South Africa, so that also must be contextualized. The inequity in our healthcare spend is paralleled in all other sectors of our economy, whether it's school, education, housing, transport, etc. And the reason for that is because our income is highly skewed. So we have amongst the most skew income distributions in the world. I mean, there's an argument about whether we're first or second or third, but we're right up there in terms of the most skew income distribution in the world. 50% of our population live under the upper bound poverty line, which is about 4,500 Rand a month ahead. I mean, we because of sort of the geospatial apartheid issues, it's very easy for us to forget how many people in South Africa live in poverty, in abject poverty. So that, as a result of the very skew income distribution, we spend different amounts of money on shoes and clothes and food and housing and education and transport and healthcare. It plays out differently in other countries. Nigeria, there's a big, only about 40% of their expenditure is funded through pooled mechanisms, and the rest of it is out of pocket. They don't have a mature insurance system like we do. Ours is, South Africa stands out because even within that private sector, it's become so well developed, that market, that it's pooled, which is highly unusual. In many other developing countries, the market out to the private market would be a predominantly out-of-pocket market rather than an insurance market. And so there are some unique characteristics of the sort of SADC area, based on the way our markets have developed.
But Barry, if you compare even our spend, and I think one of your slides does speak to the GDP percentage spends on healthcare. If you compare that even to the US, I mean, from a quality point of view of what's being delivered for 19% of GDP, compared to 8.5% in South Africa, is that still the number here?
Yeah, so it is about 8.5%. So look, the US is a massive outlier in terms of what it spends on healthcare. In fact, if you look over sort of a 10-15-year period and you take out in healthcare expenditure, the US has been in many more recessions than they think. And it's healthcare spending that props up a large portion of their economy. The bang for their buck is very poor in terms of life expectancy and various other social what do they call them, Millennium Development Goals. But there's hidden problems there, and they're not necessarily related to the healthcare system. For example, I read in a paper recently, if you remove sort of road deaths and gun violence costs, which are, again, in the US, like a massive outlier, actually the healthcare system doesn't look so bad.
Right.
So there are various other structural problems in the US political economy that make them look bad on what we would consider typical health metrics when you look at, say, European countries. So the 8.5% is par. We would overall, we would consider that par for a country in South Africa's development, probably a little bit ahead of where you would expect it to be. But again, the problem there is we actually have two economies. We don't have one economy. So you can't take the 8.5%. I mean, if you've been following the NHI parliamentary hearings now, that is the rhetoric. Well, the country is spending 8.5%, and if we spent that on everybody, we would be doing much better.
Yeah.
But the problem is it's not the Department of Health's money to spend. That's still going to be the fight. It's people spending that money willingly to avoid to buy duplicative cover, essentially. It's not so easy to just appropriate that extra 4.5%. It's going to be very difficult.
While we're talking about that, the other 90% is it 90 billion that's sitting in reserves on the medical scheme side, and again at parliamentary hearings?
Yeah. Well, so if you, I mean, there are two comments. I think, you know, that people have always worried about that. I think it's a very small chance. I mean, it would, if there's any attempt to appropriate that money, it would make like the land claims court look like a picnic. I mean, there's just no chance. I mean, that money has accumulated over the last 20 years from people's surplus arising from excess contributions in a not-for-profit setting in medical schemes. I just can't imagine that it's going to come anywhere close to NHI coffers. I mean, I would, I'll eat my hat if it happens. But
it's just
but people say it. You know, they see a pot of money lying there and they say, well, it's not doing anything, which is true because of the stupid limitations on medical scheme investment. So why don't you just put it as a jumpstart in the NHI? And again, the problem is, you know, policymakers and politicians have unfortunately done themselves no favors with mismanagement of funds. I think if there was enormous public trust, like in a very mature economy somewhere in the, I don't say Europe because, you know, you get into all sorts of colonial trouble there, but I'm saying like a well-developed, mature economy where there's trust between society and politicians and administration and bureaucracy. And you say, sure, actually, that's not a bad idea. We as a society want to move into this new world, and we've got some accumulated savings as an endowment that you can start this new fund with. I just don't think South Africa's there.
No, absolutely.
Good. Sorry, continue.
Okay, so the next point is UHC. So there's obviously some nuance in how we talk about NHI as a mechanism to universal health coverage. The point is that universal health coverage is the goal, and what that means is effective, efficient care for everybody, regardless of their means, as and when they need it. It doesn't mean utopia. It doesn't necessarily mean for free. But it does mean that there's broader access, greater access, less barriers, and that there's more equity in the system. Now, this is the difficulty we have is that structurally speaking, compared to many other developing countries, South Africa already has UHC because we have free at the point of service public healthcare for the whole country. And for those that want to opt out of that system or fund in parallel to that system, you can go to a private facility. Now, if you're earning above the means test, which is pretty low, so if you're earning any reasonable kind of income and you go to a public hospital or clinic, you probably will have to pay a co-payment, but they're not excessive. And in truth, they're not really collected at all. So structurally speaking, we are already set up for universal health coverage. The problem we have is it fails the tests of equity and it fails the tests of adequate access because we know that the public sector in particular is underfunded, under-resourced, poorly run and governed. And so the actual effective access in that setting, even though structurally it's there and free, is not at the level that is desirable. The problem is when you look at the metrics, like out-of-pocket expenditure, South Africa is very low by international standards. We are at about 8%, which is lower than many European countries, even lower than Canada. So when you look at the metrics, and the WHO and the World Bank have all of these kind of universal coverage index, all sorts of scores, and we score quite well there actually when you look internationally. But we know that on the ground, the actual delivery, leaves something to be desired. The future of healthcare is resource constrained. And so, as more and more, the demand for healthcare we know is insatiable, but resources are finite. And so what that means is there's always going to be a fight about what is paid for and what isn't paid for. Neonates are like the textbook example. And it's one of the harshest realities in any kind of, when somebody who works in healthcare, when it dawns on them that, hold on a second, the sort of naive rhetoric is you can't put a price on a life. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that that's actually how things work, that it costs money to save lives, whether it's a neonate baby or whether it's an elderly person that needs dialysis or a kidney transplant or something. If you just build on the facts, it costs money to do those treatments, whether it's staff or equipment or medicines or vaccines or whichever. That money is finite, and the demand will always exceed the available money. And so that means that there has to be choices. And how do you decide? How do you decide, is it fair to choose between saving the life of a baby or saving the life of a 70-year-old? How do you make that choice? It became particularly focused within the controversial COVID debates, because because of the age profile of those of the fatality rates for COVID are very old, not like flu, which is pretty flat. Question is, well, jeepers, we're crashing the economy, which on its own is a life support system in and of itself. It keeps people working and feeding their families, etc. It's affecting all these young people to save all these old people. Is that fair? And causes all sorts of controversial ethical debates around how you make those kind of trade-offs. I'm not going to weigh into that here. But the fact of the matter is the core central truth that remains, irrespective of your view on the matter, is that resources are constrained. And when resources are constrained, decisions have to be made about how to spend those resources. And it plays out very differently in the public sector and the private sector. You hear a private sector hospital CEO, listed hospital group CEO, say with pride that they've just saved a prem baby that was born at 550 grams. That wouldn't happen in the public sector. And the reason it wouldn't happen in the public sector is because if they did that for all 500, 600, 700 gram babies, the system would fall over. There's not enough resources. And so again, it introduced, now you see how all the ideas tie together in the previous point about why it's political, why equity is important, how much we spend in the healthcare systems relative to private versus public is important. Is it fair that a wealthy person's baby can get saved, but not a poor person's baby? Is that fair? Those are the kind of challenges that make healthcare a fascinating, complex topic. And that's not going to go away. In fact, it's going to become even more so as technologies advance and treatments become more and more nuanced and in some cases expensive. Which leads me on to our next point. Yes.
Barry, I think something you're raising now in a couple of these slides, and it's just so important. I remember the first time that some of the NHI conversations and debate happened, standing on a public platform and talking about NHI, and somebody piping up and saying, "There's nothing wrong with the healthcare system. Why do they want to change that?" And I was blown away by that statement, because you're positioning this so well. Is those of us who have got the luxury of participating in the private healthcare sector, with all its own trouble and drama and corruption and so on, which you have to acknowledge as well. It's not just a public sector issue. We can't sit as a minority saying there's nothing wrong with the healthcare system. And it's so important to balance that with the understanding of what's happening with the other 83, 85% of the population, because they live very differently, don't they?
Correct. So, I mean, and I enjoy those conversations because, there's some truths and some incompleteness in the thinking there. So, that's absolutely right. Could the public sector do better, produce better outcomes with the budget that it has? Yes, absolutely. And there's shining examples. I mean, I've come across so many examples of just extraordinary superhero public hospital managers or clinic managers or district health managers that are just those unique individuals that are so resourceful that irrespective of how little, what resources they've got, they manage to solve extraordinary problems. I mean, they're the most beautiful stories to hear, but it's still a cup of coffee every day. It's not 5 times. It's not 5 times that.
Yeah.
There is only so much you can do. Okay, the next theme for me is that the future of healthcare is personalized. So this is a great, I can't remember the name of this artist now. I should actually have it on the slide because I always forget. This artist went about and cataloged the Pantones of a whole bunch of people, and she made an artwork out of it. And the color of the background of each tile is actually the color of the Pantone of that person's skin in a particular space. And the purpose of her art was to show just how wide that palette is. It's not, we like to put people in boxes, black and white and those kind of things. And this was a beautiful piece of art that showed just how, and this was on like a massive wall in an art gallery. But we're now well beyond the point of treating people like 40 to 45-year-old males with asthma. We're now at a point where, because of social media, because of the kind of data that we're each generating, because of the advances in medical science, it's much more personalized the conversation now is about, well, what works for me? There's a growing understanding, even within clinical trials, where the burden of proof on a clinical trial is to show within some kind of all else equal double-blind controlled cohort, placebo cohort, that this medicine has a differential effect. But the real question is, why is it working in this person and not that person? Because medicine and interventions are very rarely a black and white issue. There's a degree of an effect, and that degree is so nuanced and so varied by individual. That is becoming the key question. What is it that determines that individual response to intervention and treatment? And that is leading healthcare down this line of personalization, to say, well, if we can identify those markers, you can appreciate the benefit of saying, well, this drug, this magic pill, if we give it to 1,000 people, makes a 5% difference. But if we can find the right 100 people, it makes like a 50% difference to their healthcare, to their hypertension, their diabetes. And that kind of marginal gain is much more attractive from a healthcare point of view. It also means, on the one hand, the saving of wasted resources. So you're not giving interventions and treatments and medicines to people where the effect is small or marginal at best, and you're giving it only to people where the effect is the greatest. That's an efficiency saving in the system. And that's traded off against how expensive it is to identify those people, because it's often going to involve genetics like really understanding the individual. And there's so much more science to do there that we don't yet understand, although we are breaking some very scary ground.
Barry, that's a very interesting approach on the outcomes that you're measuring there, to say, how do we match it up with right down to genetics? But I think at the same time, it's also about iterating back and saying, we can say that a certain molecule has a certain impact, and I think that it's probably a lot more contained and controlled. But when one looks at an intervention like occupational therapy or speech therapy or social work interventions, and the successful outcome post hip surgery, for example, I think that speaks again to iterating also about what are the best approaches or techniques or applications that we looked at, and continue iterating on the quality of service delivery.
Correct. And much of the personalized medicine drive is about therapeutic interventions like medicines. But it's not yet properly being applied to interventions like surgery. Who's to say that the variations we see in surgical outcomes aren't driven by some other factor other than how well the doctor's washed his hands and how well he sutured? There may well be other drivers that we don't yet understand. And
then I'm actually just looking at an article now that looks at the outcomes after hip arthroplasty. And it purely looks at being pain-free, or at a level where there's low enough pain that your functional improvements are better 2 years down the line. And only 46% of patients are finding that they're getting to an acceptable level. So it's less than 50%. So what has to be done to improve and bring the others closer to the 100% mark, I guess?
And the key question there is, what do you attribute it to? So those studies are designed to attribute it to some differential practice. Do you get the patient to get up and walk straight away, or do you what do you do proper pre-op? Do you do proper rehab post-op, and all those kind of things? And they test those individual interventions at a system level to a group of people.
Yeah.
But there's a very poor understanding about what individual variations and differences arise. And as a parent, I can tell you it's pretty surprising that we're only cottoning onto this quite recently, because I can tell you from my 3 children with the same genetic makeup, like you couldn't have 3 more different people. You can't believe they're made out of the same ingredients. It's very bizarre.
And they don't participate in the same way, do they?
No, they don't do anything in the same way. All right, that leads me on to the genetics, actually. This is another area where we spent quite a bit of time thinking, and there's actually a few different areas this plays out. So the first one is in foods, where there's been an enormous amount of genetic engineering, as we know, and a lot of it under the auspices of improved efficiency, proof from bugs, resilience against weather, and all of those kind of things. But of course, there's a big group of people that are concerned about that from a health point of view. We don't understand the knock-on effects, if there are any, over time, of genetically modified foods. And I think it's so pervasive in our diets that we wouldn't even really tell now. We buy things that are organic or free range, but to be honest, we don't know where those seeds come from. We don't know where those eggs come from. And so it's a real challenge, I think. It's so baked into our system at the moment. The potato of today is not the potato of 100 years ago. I can promise you that.
Doesn't even taste the same.
You know, so again, there's a trade-off. You know, on the one hand, we would never be able to support the population of Earth at the moment without the tremendous advances in farming and fooding, part of which are genetic modification. Now, some of that is, you know, there's different levels of that. The one is, you know, figuring out which grains are the ones that are more resilient and then focusing on those. So there's a selection effect. Obviously, the trickier ones are where they go and fiddle in the cells and make seedless watermelons. How is that possible? How are they propagating seedless watermelons? I don't understand. You know, where are the next generation of seedless watermelons coming from? My biology class didn't teach me that. Anyway, that's a problem for another day. So GM foods is one area where, you know, we're going to have to wait and see. CRISPR, I think, is the most exciting and daunting and scary, which is essentially gene editing. So they've now, you know, the genome has been mapped, and now we can go and fiddle with it. Now, I mean, if there was ever an area where, you know, the stereotypical Jeremy Clarkson, Top Gear, you know, what could go wrong statement, this is the place, right? Because you really don't know what you're messing with here. You know, you're fiddling, you're cutting and pasting with the keyboard, something that's evolved over millions of years with, you know, tens of millions of iterations to improve to the point of us being who we are. Now we're going to go and fiddle with it with scissors and some sticky tape. It's, I mean, I'm being facetious, but you understand the point I'm making. It's very treacherous territory. Never mind the ethics of it. I mean, that's a whole other area, but just the science of it, you know, is and then you get someone who goes and does something like this. You can search this up. It's a real thing. They use this technology to make a neon bunny. So, you know, they spliced the DNA of those phosphorescent animals into bunny DNA. And you can watch a video of this bunny hopping around at night, and he is phosphorescent, and you can see him in the dark, a glow-in-the-dark bunny. So, I mean, again, what could go wrong, you know? But this is the world we're in now. And of course, the concern of the culmination of all of these technologies is designer babies. And what does that mean? Is, you know, can you, and it starts off very trivially, you know, you can see the advert for the technology. We can do this test on your you know, on your DNA or on the zygote or the, you know, the earliest, you know, before it's really, we can go and fiddle with these. We can remove the risk of diabetes. Wouldn't you do that if you had the money? You know, so, you know, can remove the risk of cancer. There's cancer cells, you know, whichever the marker is for the, you know, breast cancer. We can remove that risk, like for the baby. Well, what about if you want a boy or a girl? Is that okay? What about if you want your baby to be smarter? Is that okay? All of these things are within the realm of genetic manipulation and are fraught with ethical difficulty and scientific complication that we just have no idea about. And that is the world we live in. This is our generation. This is not science fiction. Technology enabled. Now to the more benign technologies, which are nonetheless pervasive in our lives. These kind of technologies, I think, they're going to become cheaper. They're going to become smaller. They're going to become the way of things. The Internet of Things, the Internet of Medical Things, I think, is with us. And I mean, I'm very excited about what is possible here. I'm just giving some very benign examples of the sort of the glucometers. So I mean, we're interested in this sort of thing. I'm not a diabetic, but I wore a glucometer for 3 weeks. The little patch, you know, you sort of inject, you staple it onto your stomach, and it's got a tiny little needle, and it measures your blood glucose continuously. And I mean, you can do this if you're like a severe diabetic. But I mean, I like to see the graphs, and I like to sort of, you know. So I experimented with my eating for 3 weeks, different kinds of eating to monitor how my blood glucose would adapt. And I mean, I could see a very clear difference when I was eating a lot of carbs or a little bit of carbs, for example, you know, time of day, all that stuff. It was really, really fascinating. And I think we're getting to the stage quite soon, probably within the next couple of years, where the technology will be even less invasive. I mean, that's a replacement for pricking your finger. You know, I mean, if you'd like serious diabetic, insulin dependent diabetic, you need to prick your finger all the time. The continuous monitoring, you don't need to prick anything anytime. And in fact, some of them send you alarms when your, you know, your glucose is dropping, etc. And then it goes all the way to automated treatment, like a false pancreas, you know, where it like actually drip feeds you the insulin as and when for very severe cases. And I think, as I say, those technologies are going to become more commonplace. They're going to get cheaper. They're going to get smaller. The technology is going to get faster. And that's very exciting. And we think eventually, you know, the holy grail for me is tying together various of these themes, the personalized approach to medicine and management. So, you know, figuring out what works for you from a diet point of view. Yeah, more real-time, more accurate data. I sometimes have to apologize for this image, but it gets the point across the best. So we like to think about behavior. So much of what drives healthcare is about behavior. And all sorts of behavioral distortions away from the rational man, quote unquote, or woman, that contribute to unhealthy behavior. Those are the obvious things: smoking, drinking, bad eating, lack of exercise. All of those, all of our difficulties with those are driven by behavioral distortions. We don't like to do things that cause us pain. We like the immediate gratification. Hence, we like caffeine, sugar, carbs. That gives us the hit immediately. We don't trade that off well against the long-term effects of that because it's very far away. Something called hyperbolic discounting. So we heavily discount future costs of ill health and make poor choices now. And the reverse is also true. So, you know, whether it's smoking or drinking, you enjoy the effect now and you don't make good trade-offs about the future because it's far away and not important to you. And exercise is the opposite. Exercise costs some pain unless you're an exercise junkie and you get the endorphin kick out of it. I've never really, until I found jiu-jitsu. Like I couldn't, like running, cycling, like I like it, but come on. But if you find something you like, fantastic, the way you get your endorphins. But for a lot of people, exercise is a loss, and it's you know, it costs, and you've got to get up early, and all that kind of thing. Now, because that pain that comes at a cost, and the benefits are in the long term. So there you're trading off you're discounting the benefits, which you don't appreciate because they're far away, and you're like, I've just sweated my backside off. Why are my pants still so tight? Like you want the immediate benefit, right? But it's pain now and benefits later. It's the exact opposite of the immediate gratification we get. And all of that is behavior driven. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, these are the kind of books I would suggest. These are some of my favorites in this kind of area, where it speaks about, you know, why we behave the way we do, why we make the decisions we do, where the weaknesses are in the way that we think and make decisions. And they can help you, you know, think and frame those kind of things for yourself. That's a fascinating area of interest for me. Then nutrition is again like a growing important area, and again tying together the different things. We're only now understanding all of the relationships, like the gut biome, how important the bacteria in the gut are, and predictive about all manner of healthcare effects, including mental health, by the way, which I'll talk about a bit later. But the nutrition is the business. Like it's so, we've been definitely misled in terms of nutrition over the last sort of 50 years. I'm not going to put my bet down on paleo or keto or low carb, high fat or whatever, because my view is that it's actually different for different people. I can say even in my own household, like my wife and I eat different diets and they work different for us. Like we come from different backgrounds, and she can't eat what I eat because like I lean more towards the sort of fatty cream, less carbs, although I do struggle not to have the carbs, but I'm saying if I'm being disciplined. And she can't, I mean, she doesn't do rich foods, for example. So but nutrition is, I mean, it makes a massive difference to overall healthcare. I mean, and America, I think, is probably the best example of how to get it wrong. The many guidelines on how to eat well, but I mean, my view after, and I'm not a nutrition expert by any stretch, but you know, based on everything I've seen, listening to a balance of experts, my view would be that you've got to try different things and figure out what works for you, and obviously, you know, monitor whatever the key metrics are. But yeah, there are lots of important things to watch there. But nutrition is a massive deal, and I think we're only beginning to understand that now. We used to worry about the effect it would have on your teeth. That's really the least of your worries. Like, you know, metabolic syndrome, the proportion of people we have that are diabetic is just out of control and not sustainable. The future of healthcare is mental. I added this in. I don't often talk about it, but certainly we're seeing more and more. And I think after the year that 2020 and 21 has been, it's going to become even more so. The mental strain from, you know, economic pressure, job pressure, working from home stress, you know, divorce rates have gone up. Overall suicide rates haven't gone up, but in pockets, you know, there have been spikes in suicides because of the effect of COVID. We're just seeing life at the moment is just becoming more and more stressful, and it's media, it's social media, it's job stress, financial stress, family stress. It just we're at a time where it's becoming more and more difficult to be, you know, mentally healthy. And it's an underserviced area and a neglected area in terms of mental health, because it's not, you know, a treatment, and unless it's diagnosable as a chemical imbalance or something else like that, it often gets ignored. People tell, you know, people that are depressed, you know, just do some exercise, don't be so sad, do something that makes you happy. And I mean, I can tell you from personal experience with colleagues and family, that's not the case. You know, you should treat it very much like any other disease. And I think there's a stigma there that needs to be taken away. This is an area that's not going to go away in a hurry. The future of healthcare is data orientated, more and more data, whether it's devices or whether it's the Internet of Things, wearable data, you know, encounters with the healthcare system, more and more data is being collected. Exabytes is a lot. I won't go into telling you how many gigabytes that is and terabytes that is. It's a lot, and it's growing exponentially. There's just more and more data going around, and that has all sorts of implications, including safety issues, hacking risks. You know, you see lots of healthcare systems around the world getting held to ransom by hackers because healthcare data is so personal, and it's ever increasingly available. You know, the needs for, you know, protection and security, etc., are paramount, and privacy protection, because it's so sensitive. People are often blackmailed with healthcare data. It's such a rich source of personalized information. But we shouldn't shy away from it. We should invest in it. We should protect it. We should enrich it, and we should aim it at improving healthcare for the individual.
Yeah, Barry, I think it's so important to frame that, because very often people are saying, what is in my data anyway? I've got nothing to hide. But there's so much that can be done with it, a lot more than I think we can imagine. And healthcare data, I think, just to put it in perspective, is worth more on the black market than credit card information. So I think we need to be sensitized to that and understand the value of information that we're sitting on, and how we need to protect our patients' data. Yes. And that the data is used for the right reasons. I think Poppy, I hope everyone's ready for the 1st of July. But Poppy's driving that focus even more. Huh?
Absolutely. And then the last one, which is almost a culmination of all of these points, is that the future of healthcare is expensive. We're not going to, there's no silver bullet in healthcare's future that's going to all of a sudden make it cheaper. There's lots of effort. You know, digital healthcare, being treated at home, value-based care teams, and all manner of other things. That's really all just to bend the curve down so that the increases are sustainable, but it's unavoidably expensive. It costs money to develop the interventions. It costs money to hire, train, use the professionals that are required in the healthcare system. It costs money to build the hospitals, to invest in the new technologies that we're talking about. We're not going to go away there. It's probably 10 trillion already. Overall, dragged quite a lot up by the USA at 10% of GDP on healthcare. Other countries are a bit lower than that, typically between 4 and 8%. But it's a lot of money. It's a massive part of the global economy. That's not going to change in a hurry. It's a fascinating place to work. Many challenges. And we certainly enjoy facing those challenges to try to make it better where we can. So that's all I wanted to share in terms of slides, Dion and Lani.
Barry, you were talking about sort of value-based care there. I'm interested to hear your thoughts around how that gets remunerated. Are you pro or against something like an alternative reimbursement model versus a fee for service, or what's your thoughts around that?
No, so we quite like it. It's really it's a question of whether you get paid for activity or whether you get paid for outcome. So in other words, do you get paid for I'm trying to think of a good sort of metaphor example.
Putting a needle in a patient versus getting paid for you.
So let's say you bake cakes is your job, right? Do you get paid for going through the process of baking the cake, which is mixing the ingredients, putting it in the oven, taking it out the oven, cutting it up, or do you get paid for actually there's an edible piece of cake at the end? Now, the fee for service is a perfectly I'll paraphrase a Winston Churchill quote. It's the worst form of reimbursement, except for all the others, which is what he said about democracy. It's the worst form of government, except for all the others. So it's not a great. I mean, there's benefits to it. It matches cost. It doesn't really put the provider at any kind of risk. Other than the cost of setting up the practice, but you get paid for what you do. Like, it makes sense. You're selling, your lawyers sell their time, doctors sell their time. It's the same. But the question is not, is it a bad thing? The question is, can it be improved? Can we have a different model that aligns the parties of the incentives in an improved way? I mean, I've yet to see implemented in South Africa a large-scale, all-encompassing silver bullet alternative reimbursement model. There's lots of interesting examples, some capitation orientated, some building in enhanced fees and bonuses, for lack of a better word, for improved outcomes. So there are definitely areas where it makes sense to invest in alternative reimbursement models and explore them. Some areas it's much more difficult.
Yeah. Dion, what does the regulators these days have to say about alternative reimbursement models?
Thanks, Lonnie. I was gunning for that statement. I'm just flicking through some of the information that's actually come out from the HPCSA, and the important one is that many are saying, and I think it was also specifically under previous leadership within the HPCSA, where they were vehemently opposed to any form of alternative reimbursement. From stages that I'd been on at roadshows, it was that cannot be done. End of story. That was actually even put out in a statement by the HPCSA a couple of years ago.
Dr. Letlapi is an incredibly outspoken critic of alternative reimbursement models. You must appreciate the irony, right? Mm-hmm. So in the public sector, doctors and other providers are remunerated by a salary, which is the most
extreme form of global fee.
Yes. Oh, don't know where Barry went now.
Extreme form of alternative. The alternative of the extreme is the other extreme is fee for service. Attain both of the extremes, but not the middle, which is bizarre.
It is absolutely bizarre. Barry, I think you got a bit of jitter there, so I'm not jumping in there. But I mean, that was in 2017 that it was stated categorically you cannot do it, and it's very encouraging. I can post this out to everyone if you want to have a look at it. But in a more recent statement from the HPCSA, sort of towards the end of last year, they specifically said practitioners are advised that it is permissible for them to enter into global fee contracts. Okay, but there's provisos that provided that contracts comply with specific ethical rules. And the HPCSA actually put out a really good document saying these are the different ethical rules that we're concerned might be contravened should you enter into global fees. So make sure that you're not exposed to these, that you maintain your clinical autonomy, that your sharing of fees is looked at and you understand where and how that is shared. And all of the others, commission-based sort of perverse incentives, over-servicing. So one has to go through all of those as you do with anything that you're engaging with, making sure that you comply with your regulator. But it's quite an about turn that we've seen there, which is quite encouraging. I mean, the Health Professions Councils under the auspices of the Department of Health, appointed by the Minister of Health. So it's so interesting to see that NHI is saying we need to look at alternative reimbursement models, and the HPCSA is saying you may not. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, I mean that's one thing. Just touching on one of the questions in the chat there. I mean, nothing on NHI is going to happen in a hurry. That much I can guarantee you. You know, it's there's very little agreement, even amongst people not necessarily in the private sector's camp, There's going to be lots of fighting, and the number of regulations and rules that are going to have to change, and the amount of time it'll take for people to get on the same page is astronomical.
For sure. Lonnie, I'm not sure if we've got the functionality. I see there are 2 hands up. Are we able to give people a chance to actually speak, or are we just going to ask?
No, not at the moment, but please feel free to just post your question or your comment in the chat or in the Q&A functionality.
Barry, there was a question just about you talking about NHI and how quick it's going to happen or not. Sorry, Lonnie, if I'm jumping here.
No,
But
no.
Michael just had a question just around Canada. He understands from people in Canada that they're actually revising their NHI and possibly pursuing a different strategy, which we know has been in place for some time. Are we chasing something here that we might end up doing a full 360 and find ourselves back on ourselves again?
It's hard to say. I mean, if you look at, I mean, as much as the UK love the NHS even, I mean, the NHS deficit is more money than we spend on our whole healthcare system, public and private. So it's not all roses, you know. I mean, they have trouble. That, you know, they have what they call the postcode lottery. They have their own equity problems. They're underfunded. They, you know, trying to cut budgets and cut staff and everything. It's not plain sailing just because you've got a UHC NHI kind of system. There's no free lunch. All healthcare systems are struggling, you know, with their own challenges. There are some better models than others. I mean, we particularly like the Dutch and the German systems where there's, you know, parallel, there's mandatory membership, but there's parallel systems. Some are public, some are private. You know, you can choose, and there's some mobility and portability between those kind of funds. And that kind of flexibility allows an element of managed competition, which we think is better for the system than a sort of monopsonistic and monopsonistic purchaser. So yeah, there are some systems that are better. Canada is interesting. I mean, their healthcare system is pretty well regarded internationally, given how much they spend. But it's, I mean, you also have to take into account the geography. Like, you know, it's quite, there's a sort of couple of big urban centers, lots of rural space. So yeah, I'm not actually up to speed with what's the latest that's going on in the Canada health reform. I know they've got quite big chunks of their healthcare spend carved out into private health insurance, medicine even, like all medicine is in a PHI environment, which is almost medicine, which is interesting carve out. So yeah, I'll have to go and have a look and see what they're up to.
Yeah, I think in all of these, you still see that even where there is a strong sort of socialist health system or national health system, that there's always space for private healthcare. I mean, you're seeing it in the
Always.
UK. I think you worked in the private.
There's no economy that I know of where there's zero private healthcare.
And it's healthy competition, isn't it? As emerging.
It can be unhealthy as well, but if you get it right and you get the structure right and the market sort of conduct and rules of the game right, then it can be healthy.
Yeah.
One thing that keeps popping up here is I hear data and data capturing, whether it's personalized or general, and healthcare data is just on the forefront. And I think the more accessible it's going to become to where your wearables, whether it's for diabetes monitoring, blood glucose, or just your heart rate or your SATs or anything like that. But it all relates back to capturing data, capturing outcome measures. And Dion, Barry, is there a specific platform, the one better than the other? What's the best way of dealing with all this data? Because we're sitting on so much information, but what do we do with it? What's the next step? Because I think a lot of healthcare professionals, even in their practices, they capture data, but now what? What's the next step?
Yeah. So a lot of there's a lot of power in the data that you know, hasn't yet been harnessed. I think the data sitting in doctors' rooms. I'll give an example. As data rich as the private sector is, you know, it's not all free flowing. So like it should, if you would think about it, it should be very interesting for a healthcare administrator, a medical scheme, to know which of their members are smokers, what the BMI of their members is, but they don't know that. The hospitals know it. Every time you go in, they're going to take you through that questionnaire. What are you allergic to? Are you a smoker? Are you a drinker? What's your height? What's your weight? All that data is there somewhere. Now, you would think that as a medical scheme, you would be interested in getting that data to improve your risk management capabilities and risk sort of triage, but they don't get that data. So there's an enormous amount of data out there. On the other hand, you know, the doctors and professional practitioners, and forgive me for saying this to this audience, they tend to think about the patient in front of them. this patient comes to me, I'm going to treat them for this particular condition.
Mm.
And as a result of that, where the power of data is looking at populations and being able to understand nuance in those populations. Is this person in front of me different from the 1,000 other people? What makes them different? And should I treat them differently? And sort of individual professional practitioners tend not to have that sort of 3,000 feet view. They've got the 3 feet view, but not the 3,000 feet view. And so there is an enormous potential of data to harness the power of data to improve things, both at a macro level to understand and be able to identify where there's inefficiencies and room for improvement, but also in the way that plays out in the individual.
Barry, there's been quite a lot of talk politically, I guess, and in the NHI conversations about empowering these. And I must declare, I think right from the green paper and the white paper, there's been some very good fundamental principles that are underpinning the NHI. We just have to be able to implement it. It will make it better than the private sector. One of them is outcome measures, and the other one is the data management. Have you got any insight, excuse the pun, any insight into the moves as far as establishing the health information exchange, which has been spoken of, the central platform for that?
So
and secondly, the outcomes measures platforms. I know that the recent sort of declarations from the Health Market Inquiry was the HQA would take point on that as an interim. So these I'm encouraged by these because it gives it legs. It actually starts putting some material behind this. But where are we at the moment with both of these?
Yeah, so look, the Health Information Exchange is, as it currently stands, a not-for-profit JV between the big 3 organizations on each side, the big 3 hospital groups and the big 3 administrators.
Mm-hmm.
They've put, a goodly amount of money into it to get it up and running. My understanding, I actually had a chat with the CEO of them earlier this week, is that they're at the point now where, the way I put it, the little green shoots are going to start to show now soon.
Oh, right.
So there's a couple of use cases that they're bringing to market. Obviously, it's within that ecosystem, but they've done all the work on the hard yards in terms of data protection, agreeing the rules of the game, because you can imagine some of that data is contentious. I think we are going to see some exciting things there. What's important to me there are to understand, number one, who's allowed to access the data and what are the playing rules there. And number two, as quickly as possible, bringing everybody else in the market to the table, because it's a terribly unfair competitive advantage, I think, to sort of ring fence innovative technology and not let other people participate in that market.
Yeah.
And I can understand why they went about it that way, but I think it's very important that the rest of the market come along as quickly as possible.
Sure. And then as far as the outcomes measures, sort of centralizing.
Yeah, the outcomes measures, it's a little sore topic for me. I mean, we would love to do the measurement, but I'll have to try and convince HQA to let us do the actuarial work.
Yeah.
I think it's coming. I mean, it's much too slow. I mean, how long has it been even since the HMI inquiry? Things shouldn't take that long.
Yeah.
But I think some kind of measurement is imperative. How you go about it, is it a hard measure? Is it a patient-reported outcome, patient-reported experience measure? There are various different metrics now, mechanisms you can use to collect the data.
Yeah.
But it's coming. We've become very good at measuring how much healthcare costs, but not so good at measuring what that cost is buying us. Those metrics are coming.
Sure. I think Lonnie is going to look at the time, but I'm going to give you one chance quickly, just to in those minutes. You guys are doing some incredible work in the patient-reported outcome measures and the voice of the patient. Maybe that's something we can talk about. But
very keen. So as I said, I mean, we've become very adept at measuring and analyzing costs, but that's only one part of the equation. We've had a very successful rollout in our Australian division of a platform that we've developed called Voice of the Patient, where across what would be their equivalent of the BHF, 80% of the medical funds we're now sending surveys to patients that have had a variety of different interventions, different surgeries, different treatments, been to hospital, been to their primary care physician, etc., and asking them a range of scientifically validated questions specific to that intervention, and then collating that data. So we'll be sending out probably in the order of about 5,000 surveys a month into that population. And we're ready to rock and roll with that here as well. So we're starting to speak now to some medical schemes and some other entities around doing that same kind of thing here. With that, and the theme of it, or the area is called patient-reported outcomes, as you say, PROMs. Outcomes are, I mean, it was belittled by doctors and academics for quite some time, because what does the patient know about their outcome? Well, actually, it turns out quite a lot, and it's highly correlated with clinical outcomes and cost, complication rates, and all of those kind of things, as it turns out. And so, being able to harvest that data and use it and integrate it into alternative reimbursement models, or contracting, or negotiations, or engagement, or just for the betterment of your own practice, is an important step in development.
And we'd love to work. We'd also give those insights to healthcare practitioners, associations, and society, so they can also help guide and drive professions.
Everyone wants to be a better doctor or psychologist, or but how do you know? I mean, when we benchmark GPs, the first thing I sit down with them and I say, okay, I know what's in the data, but you tell me what makes a good doctor. And I'll tell you whether I can measure that in the data. I don't know, but I can tell you what's in the data. And if you tell me the questions to ask, I can tell you how we can answer them from the data, or if we need to collect new data points.
$1 million question.
Excellent. Fascinating conversation that can definitely carry on for many more minutes, but we do need to wrap up. Barry, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully we can call on you again in the near future. I think everyone here enjoyed the conversation tremendously.
Absolute pleasure.
Dion, perhaps a closing remark from you, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks very much. I've got a string of questions here. You always prepare yourself to go, how are we going to keep ourselves busy for an hour? And then when you look again, the time's up. Barry, I've got a lot of discussions and points. I think as an actuary, you've been very restrained not to delve into data. I know that's something close to your heart. So I'd love to have a session that we can perhaps sort of circle back on data,
absolutely.
the value of data, and how we actually harness that in the real world, not in theory. So if you are available, I'd love to unpack that.
Yeah, it was great fun. Anytime.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Barry. Really appreciate your time.
Excellent. Dion, thanks to you too. We are going to wrap up. For any of our future webinars, please keep a close eye on our social media. You'll receive invitations via email or even SMS or the websites. That is all from us at the moment. I did very recently just post all the links again in the chat functionality, where you can find the YouTube link, podcast, etc., etc. This will shortly be made available as well. But in the meantime, stay safe, look after yourself and your families, and especially look after your mental health. Until we see each other next time, take care and have a lovely evening.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Barry. Lonnie. Bye-bye.